November 30th, 2017. So we are looking at a photo of our moon. A very usual sight, something that we are used to seeing. No big deal. It was always there, wasn't it? It's just a simple satellite that orbits our planet. There's so much with the moon that just defies explanation. For instance, how big is the moon? Let us start there. So obviously it's the brightest object in our night sky. It appears really large. That's because it's the closest body to us. So it's a bit more than 1/4 the size of the Earth. It's 27% the size of the Earth. So that is a much smaller ratio than the other planets and their moons. Earth moon is the 5th largest moon in the solar system, and that's including the moons of the giants, Saturn and Jupiter. The moon's mean radius is 1,079 miles, and you double that to get the diameter, 2,159 miles, less than a third of the width of the Earth. So if Earth were the size of a nickel, the moon would be about as big as a coffee bean. So it's an unusually large object in comparison to the planet that it circles around. Now, we've had a big eclipse earlier this year, and is it a coincidence that the sun and the moon appear to be the same size? The sun and the moon appear to be the same size in the Earth's sky because the sun's diameter is about 400 times greater, but the sun is also about 400 times farther away. Isn't that an amazing coincidence? It's just so oddly unusual, and it must just simply be a coincidence, right? I guess it's just one of those things you can't explain, right? The rotation of the moon is locked by gravity, so we only see the one side of the moon all the time. And this is unusual with moons and planets. Not that it doesn't happen, it does sometimes, but it's very unusual and extremely unusual when comparing the size of the moon to the size of the Earth, because the moon is so large compared to the Earth. So at all times, we only see one side of the moon. The other side is kept hidden from us. And it happens to rotate on its axis once in the same time as it takes to orbit us once. So, without the moon, we would not have months, because that's where months come from, the moon. Things would be very, very different here on the Earth without the moon. Here you can see the relative size of planets in the solar system. And you can see how big the Earth is in comparison to Jupiter and Saturn. And now here we can see the moons of the solar system, scaled to the Earth's moon. So you can see the biggest moons in the solar system are not that much bigger than the moon of the Earth. And yet the Earth is just a small fraction of the size of Jupiter or Saturn. So again, very unusual to have a planet the size of the Earth having a moon the size of our moon. And here's another one to give you a good look. In fact, you could actually see that some moons are actually bigger than Pluto. Now, scientists say that the moon and the Earth formed out of identical material. So, how did they get that idea? Where did they get that idea from? Well, it really comes from the samples that we took on the lunar missions. Of course, there are so many people that say that these were completely hoaxes, completely faked, and they never really happened. So we're basing our assumption on NASA Do we want to do that? We know NASA's never a straight answer. We know they have agenda and they want to cover things up at all costs. So how do we know that the samples that they got from the moon just simply aren't taken from somewhere on the Earth? Because that's what we're basing our whole science of knowing what the moon is made of on. So what is the moon really? There are so many different legends that point to it being something not natural, something that was actually brought here and put here on purpose, something that enables others to watch over us and to monitor us. In fact, there are so many things that point to it being hollow. Just for one, look at the craters. The relative width of the craters compared to their depth doesn't make any sense unless you have some sort of metallic, strong outer shell that is not too far under the surface, that is keeping asteroids from going and punching in deeper, because you will not find any super deep craters on the moon. And yet, when we look at the size of the moon, the mass of the moon, the moon is nowhere near as heavy as the Earth and as dense as the Earth. And in fact, it's 1/81st of the Earth as far as the weight of it, even though it's 27% of the size. So we also have these legends in various locales that state that before the flood there was no moon. So there are many indigenous peoples that have legends about a time when in the night sky the brightest, most dominant thing was Venus, and the moon was not there. And in fact, they remember when it came there. And many of the legends talk about it coming there just prior to the arrival of the Olympian gods. So very, very interesting stuff. So, this has been noticed in this article. This is from Pravda. This has been noticed by the people who lived in the south of Greece, as well as by African tribes and others. There's different stories all around the world that talk about a time when the Earth did not have a moon. And same thing from the Mayan civilization, and all over. So very, very interesting. And again, this goes into it. So Aristotle himself wrote that in Arcadia in Greece, before being inhabited by the Hellenes, it had a population of Pelagians, and that these aboriginals occupied the land already before there was a moon in the sky above the earth. And for this reason, they were called Proselines, those of before the earth. Apollonius of Rhodes mentioned the time when not all the orbs were yet in the heavens, before the Danae and Deucalion races came into existence, and only the Arcadians lived. Now, Danae, I believe, goes to the Tuatha De Danann, which are kind of like a fairy folk of Celtic mythology, and some people believe that they're related to the elves, which could also be related to what we would take to be the Nords, the Nordic alien race. So many, many, many illusions and myths of a time before the moon was in place. So what would Earth be like without the moon? Well, everything would kind of change. Definitely we would not have as strong a tide system. We would have no months. Also, the days would be a lot shorter because the Earth would rotate faster on its axis. So they estimate that it would have been around a 10-hour long day without the moon being in place. So here are some facts about the moon that are surprising. The size and the orbit are perfect. The chances of the moon being exactly 400 times smaller than the diameter of the sun, and yet 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun, I mean, they're infinitesimal. There's no way that's a coincidence. Absolutely no way. And then also locked into an orbit where we can't see the backside. So, beings would be free to come and go from the backside all day long, and we'd never notice. So that is one thing. The fact that it appears to be hollow, and we know this from some tests that were done. So after the landing of the lunar module on Apollo 12 on the surface of the moon not only rang like a bell, she was doing it for more than an hour. So if it gonged from the impact of the Apollo 12 module, that would show that it's not solid. And during the next mission, the reverberation was measured again. This time the effect was even greater, and the ringing lasted more than 3 hours. Despite the assumption that the moon might indeed be hollow based on their own experiments, NASA, the results were largely hidden, of course. So it's been tested, and they know, and they actually crashed things into it to test it. So it is hollow. And not only that, but there's ground-penetrating radar that they've used to verify that it is definitely hollow. The craters don't line up. They just don't line up. And there are some definite artificial structures on the surface. Definitely artificially placed in orbit, perfect orbit. And, it's pretty indisputable that, there's too many things that just are beyond coincidence. So if somebody put it there, it must be a very intelligent race, and it would be perfect to put it there because then they could watch us from it, and they could also come down and use it as a base, just like it would be a perfect base for us to go up and to go out. Haven't you asked yourself, why don't we have bases on the moon when we supposedly landed on it in 1969? 50 years ago, just about. 50 years ago. If you went back into the early 70s and you asked people, well, what do you think, is going to be up with the moon in 50 years? Who wouldn't have said, oh, well, I'm sure we have tons of bases there, and we'll probably be over by Mars and on Mars by then. Why did we never make a base? It makes absolutely no sense with the, pitiful technology we had then compared to now to be landing people on it. Why did we stop going? Unless we weren't allowed, or unless it just totally got covered up what we're doing. There is no logical reason for it. None, and anybody that doesn't look into it just is kind of like sticking their head in the sand and humming because they just don't want to know. So, of course, the spin is another thing. And then, the real story of the moon, there's so many sources coming out. Alex Collier, for one, that talk about how the moon was actually placed here. The moon was actually a spaceship. Some believe the moon is an actual ark, and that the moon is what brought life here. And there are legends from many Native American tribes that talk about this. And just read some of the myths and the legends about how we were brought here by the gods and placed here. So, according to Alex Collier, the moon was actually a huge spaceship, came here millions of years ago. She brought the reptilians, hybrids, humans and reptiles, as well as the first people that set foot. He says that the moon is empty, and the surface there are several secret entrances leading inside, because the surface of the moon is a metal shell under which hides the remains of an ancient alien bases left over from a huge war 113,000 years ago. Today the bases are occupied by the secret world government, which works together with alien races. So, and there's other sources that say basically the same thing, just varying on time. Very, very similar. And again, many ancient writings about time before the moon. Aristotle, as we talked about, Apollonius of Rhodes, the Chichiba tribe in Colombia, similar oral legends, and the Zulus as well. The Zulus say that the moon was pulled and brought here. So, Corey Good, same thing. There's just source after source after source. So when you look up at the moon, you are probably looking at a UFO in a sense. So how about the traditions of the Watchers? There are the traditions of the Watchers in Jewish and Christian legends, as well as in Islam. And these are the beings that watch over the earth. These are some of them that fell to the earth because they found the daughters of man beautiful and decided they wanted to take wives in Genesis 6. The Grigori, from Italian witchcraft, is interesting because the Grigori are also basically watchers, those that watch. And it's the same thing from the Italian witchcraft tradition. And the Grigori are some that give a witch her powers. And this is a photo from Betty Luca Andreasen. Now, she was abducted, and this is going back into, I believe, the 70s or the 60s. I'm going to do a video on her because it was an interesting one. And she was taken up into a spaceship, and she saw people of all races kept in these stasis chambers, and they were being basically abducted, and they would be sometimes released on other planets. The thing that was so interesting is she was abducted by Greys, and when she asked them who they were, they said they were the Watchers. And it wasn't just the Greys that she saw. She also saw Nordic-looking beings that were very, very tall, very much like the Elohim, the Anunnaki, and she also saw some reptilian beings. So, again, these are the Watchers, those that have been watching. And where have they been watching us from? Well, of course, they have ships, that are coming and going all the time, but also the moon. The moon is the base from which they operate and have operated. And it's been staring us in the face all this time. So what's your thoughts on this? Please leave your questions, comments, your thoughts on all this down below. If you found this interesting, definitely give it a thumbs up. Share it so we could get the word out and make more people aware. 30, 40 years ago, most people would think you're crazy. Now maybe only half the people think you're crazy, or probably even less than half, as people are becoming aware of all the tie-ins, how all this really goes together. There's only one possible explanation for all this. There's just one, and it's been staring us in the face. If you like this, again, please thumbs up it and subscribe if you haven't subscribed, so you can get some more updates that will be coming. And next time you look up in the sky and you see the moon, maybe you're going to view it in a little different light. Thank you, my friends, for joining me at Evolutionary Energy Arts once again. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care.